So, research published in the last decade has established something that I think fundamentally changes how we should be thinking about aging. Your biological age and your chronological age are not the same thing. The number of years you've been alive tells you very little about the actual state of your cells and your hormones and your brain and your metabolism, all of these different things. And the gap between the two, between how old you are and how old your biology is largely determined by three processes that begin accelerating after the age of 14. Now, understanding these processes is, in my view, the most important thing that you can do for your long-term health. And the reason I feel so strongly about that comes directly from clinical practice. Because in emergency medicine, you see both ends of that spectrum every single shift. And I see around 20 or 30 patients every single day. So all the time we see patients like the 70-year-old who walks in really sharp, independent, managing their own medications, they deal with a minor issue, and then they go home. And then you see the 58-year-old who's been in and out of the department 4 times that month, who is on 12 medications, whose functional capacity is essentially the same as somebody 20 years older. And when you look closely at what separates those two people, not always, because obviously life is complicated and genetics matter and all of that sort of thing, but often what separates them is decades of cumulative biological processes that either compounded against them or didn't. What those processes are, why they accelerate after 40, and what you can do to slow them down, that is exactly what I want to walk you through today. 3 core reasons why people age faster after the age of 40. So the first thing people notice is their energy levels. And I'm not talking about tiredness, the way you feel after a bad night's sleep. That is something completely different. This is something a lot deeper. Fatigue that becomes the default rather than the exception, where getting through a normal day feels like it takes more out of you than it used to, where you used to recover from a hard week and feel fine by Sunday, but now it lingers into the following week and maybe the one after that. That is the sort of tiredness I'm talking about, where it just sort of seeps into your bones and you feel drained all the time. The kind of tiredness that doesn't quite resolve with rest the way it once did. And the research backs this up in a pretty significant way. So studies on self-reported energy levels show a consistent dip beginning in the early to mid-40s. So this isn't a catastrophic drop, this is a gradual erosion. But compounded over a decade, it's significant enough that many people describe themselves in the 50s as feeling like a fundamentally different person than who they were at 35. It's the same life, the same general health, but operating at a lower level. The second thing people notice is physical capacity, so their strength drops. Moving around the house becomes harder. Things you used to do without thinking, like carrying heavy bags up the stairs, or playing on the floor with your kids or grandkids, whatever, getting out of a low chair without using your hands, all of these start to feel like more of an effort. And this matters far more than people realize, because your physical capacity isn't just about how you feel in the gym. It's directly tied to your independence, your confidence, and your quality of life in a way that almost nothing else is. There is a clinical measure called grip strength that researchers use as this proxy for overall physical function. And the data consistently shows that low grip strength in midlife is one of the strongest predictors of disability and early death as you get older, decades later. Not because grip strength itself is magical, but because it reflects something real about the underlying state of your body. Now, the third thing, and the one that I think is most important but least talked about, is what I'd call a stepwise decline. So aging doesn't happen in a straight line. It happens in drops, like steps. You have an event like an illness or an injury or a period of chronic stress, whether it's financial or work or family, and you don't quite return to where you were before. And then that step, that event, becomes a new lower baseline, and then the next event drops you again.
So whether it's a back injury or a leg injury, this means you stop exercising for 6 weeks. So you lose strength, you gain a bit of weight, you feel less confident moving, so you move less, you eat a little worse because you're not feeling great about yourself, and then suddenly you are in a completely different physical shape than you used to be. Not because of aging, but because of a sequence of events that compounded on each other. And that is the pattern of what we see. And once you see it in clinical practice like that, you cannot unsee it. Aging, as I said, isn't a gradual decline. It happens in steps, normally triggered by stress or an illness or an injury or something similar. So here's the real question here then. We're not talking about what triggers those drops. We've already covered that. Things like injuries, illnesses, stress, those things are part of life and they always will be. The real question is why after 40, those same events start leaving a mark that they didn't used to leave. Why recovery is slower, why the baseline shifts downward instead of resetting. Why the same body that used to absorb a setback and then bounce back seems to absorb it but then stay there. That is what I want to get into in this video. Because underneath every one of those drops, there are 3 biological processes that are quietly weakening your body's ability to recover. And once you understand what they are, this whole picture starts to make a lot more sense. Your mitochondria are the energy factories inside your cells. Every cell in your body, so your muscle cells, your heart cells, your brain cells, every single cell relies on mitochondria to generate the fuel that keeps it going. As you get older, 2 things seem to happen. The first one is that you produce fewer mitochondria. The second thing is that the ones you do have become less efficient at doing their job. And the result is less energy being produced at the cellular level, right down at the bottom, which means slower recovery from physical effort and a kind of persistent fatigue that isn't explained by any single thing. It's just the background hum of a less efficient system. The scientific term for this is mitochondrial dysfunction, and it's one of the most well-established facts in aging research. There's a landmark paper called The Hallmarks of Aging, first published in 2013 and obviously updated since, that identifies the key biological drivers of the aging process, and mitochondrial dysfunction is right there at the top. It is not some wacky fringe idea. It is central to how scientists understand why we age. But here's the part that really matters. So mitochondrial decline is just a normal part of aging, but it is significantly accelerated by how you live. So sitting too much accelerates it. Eating a lot of ultra-processed food accelerates it. Chronic stress accelerates it. Poor sleep and other things that we know are bad for us. All these things accelerate it. The people who feel absolutely wiped out in their 50s, who feel like they've aged 10 years in just 2 years, often aren't just aging, they are aging inside a lifestyle that is attacking their mitochondria every single day. There's another thing that's really worth knowing about. So mitochondria accumulate damage over time through a process called oxidative stress, where the normal byproducts of energy production cause cellular wear and tear. They start to trigger inflammation. So mitochondrial decline doesn't just reduce your energy, it actively feeds the other drivers of accelerated aging, which I'll come on to in a few minutes. The good news here is that the mitochondria respond to exercise in ways that almost nothing else does. Aerobic exercise, like consistent, sustained cardio, stimulates something called mitochondrial biogenesis. Your body literally makes new mitochondria in response to the demand you place on it. Resistance training, so whether that's weights or body weight work, this improves the efficiency of the existing mitochondria in your muscle tissue. So this is one of the rare situations in biology where you can actually reverse a significant part of the damage. Not completely, not forever, but meaningfully enough to change how you feel every day.
After the age of 40, your hormonal environment changes in ways that touch almost every aspect of how your body works. Most people have a vague sense that hormones are involved in aging without really understanding which ones or how or why any of this stuff even matters. So let me go through the main ones for you. Testosterone is the most obvious one, and it applies to both men and women, but obviously in different ways. In men, testosterone peaks in the late teens and early 20s, and then declines at roughly 1 to 2% per year from the mid-30s onward. By the time a man is in his late 50s, he might have 30 to 40% less testosterone than he did at his peak, and that is not insignificant. Testosterone drives muscle growth, it maintains bone density, it supports your mood and your motivation, and plays a significant role in recovery from exercise. When it drops, all of those things become harder. In women, the picture is a bit more complex. So testosterone also declines, but obviously the more dramatic shift is the drop in estrogen and progesterone through perimenopause and menopause. Typically between the mid-40s and early 50s, though it does start earlier for many women, and this can be entirely normal.
Estrogen has protective effects on the heart, on bone density, on brain function, and metabolic health as well. It is hugely important. When it drops, women often see rapid changes in body composition, sleep quality, mood, and energy that can feel extremely sudden. And then we've got insulin resistance. Now this is where your cells gradually stop responding properly to the insulin signal to absorb glucose from your blood. It gets worse steadily with age, and it's made significantly worse by a sedentary lifestyle, excess body fat around the organs, poor sleep, and chronic stress. When you become more insulin resistant, your body has to produce more insulin to manage your blood sugar. Energy becomes less stable. You get sharper crashes after meals. Fat accumulates more easily, particularly around the abdomen. And over time, if it progresses, you're looking at prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, which then trigger their own cascade of massive health problems. Now, cortisol is the fourth hormone here, and it's probably the most overlooked one. How many people really know what cortisol does? Well, cortisol is your primary stress hormone. It's not inherently bad. It is essential for getting you out of bed in the morning and responding to demands. But in midlife, when life becomes objectively more complicated, like more responsibilities, less sleep, more financial pressure, looking after aging parents while also raising children, cortisol levels tend to run chronically higher. And chronically elevated cortisol does something very specific. It breaks down your muscle tissue. It's catabolic, which means it eats into the very thing that you need to protect the most. It also promotes fat storage, particularly around the organs, what we call visceral fat. And it suppresses the immune system in ways that slow recovery and increase vulnerability to illness. The hormonal shift after 40 isn't just about feeling tired or losing muscle tone. It is a fundamental change in the chemical environment your body is operating in, one that makes almost every aspect of physical and metabolic health harder to maintain. And here's the really important thing. You cannot stop testosterone declining. You cannot stop menopause naturally, but you can dramatically influence how fast insulin resistance develops, how high cortisol runs, and how quickly muscle is lost. Those are the things that you absolutely can control. Resistance training is the most evidence-backed intervention for hormonal health in midlife, full stop. And lots of people are starting to talk about this sort of thing. We know that it improves your insulin sensitivity, it supports healthy testosterone levels, it reduces the damage that cortisol does to your muscle tissue, and the research behind this is consistent and really well understood. The third one is all about chronic inflammation. This is the one that I want to spend extra time on because it's the least understood of the three, and it's possibly the most important one. So when people hear the word inflammation, they think of something visible like a hot, swollen knee or ankle, or a sore throat, or the warmth around a healing wound. That is what we call acute inflammation, short-term inflammation, and it's a good thing. It is your immune system doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
But that's not what we're talking about here. Chronic, what we mean is long-term chronic low-grade inflammation, sometimes called inflammaging in the research literature because of how tightly it maps onto the aging process, is something entirely different. It has no obvious symptoms. You can't see it or feel it directly, but it is measurable in your bloodstream through markers like C-reactive protein or CRP and interleukin-6, IL-6, and its consequences are enormous. Chronic inflammation is now understood to be a central driver of virtually every major age-related disease, like heart disease or type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, cancer, autoimmune conditions. The evidence for this has been building for decades. Oh, what causes it then? Well, several things cause it, and they're all depressingly familiar. So visceral fat, which is the fat that sits around your internal organs, not the fat under your skin, is metabolically active in a way that most people don't realize. It continuously releases pro-inflammatory molecules called cytokines into your bloodstream. The more visceral fat that you carry, the higher your level of inflammation. Now, ultra-processed food also drives it through lots of different pathways, like your gut microbiome. It spikes your blood sugar, and it triggers inflammatory signaling that runs in the background constantly. Poor sleep is another major driver.
Even 1 or 2 nights of significantly disrupted sleep produces measurable increases in inflammatory markers. Chronic stress activates inflammatory responses through the cortisol pathway. And then alcohol, something that rarely gets discussed in this context but really should, is a direct and well-documented driver of all 3 processes simultaneously. It impairs mitochondrial function, it disrupts your hormone balance, and it raises inflammatory markers in ways that are dose-dependent and cumulative. In a demographic that often drinks more than it realizes, especially here in the US, even just a bottle of wine with dinner that becomes the norm rather than the exception, this is a meaningful accelerant that deserves to be named. Alcohol is not good for you. Now, what chronic inflammation does in practical terms is make everything slower. Recovery from exercise is slower. Recovery from illness is slower. Repair of damaged tissue is slower. It contributes to joint pain and stiffness that many people assume is just wear and tear. It feeds back into mitochondrial decline. It worsens insulin resistance, and it accelerates muscle loss in ways that I'm about to explain in a few minutes. There's a concept in the science of aging called the inflammatory threshold. We all have a baseline level of inflammation, and as long as it stays below a certain point, your body can manage it. But the thing is, as you get older, that baseline tends to rise, and once it crosses a threshold, you start seeing accelerated decline across multiple systems at the same time. That is the point at which things start to compound, and compound really fast. Let's talk about muscle now. So most people think about muscle in terms of how they look or how strong they feel in the gym. But muscle is not just a physical structure. It is an organ. It is one of the most important organs in your body for long-term health. And here's what I mean by this. So muscle tissue is your body's largest glucose sink or disposal center. Basically, what it means is it's responsible for absorbing the majority of the carbohydrates you eat and turning them into usable energy. When you have good muscle mass, even if you're in your 80s or 90s, your blood sugar is managed efficiently and your insulin sensitivity stays high. When you lose muscle, your blood sugar becomes harder to regulate, insulin resistance gets worse, and the metabolic environment that your body operates in starts to deteriorate. But that's only part of it. So muscle, when it contracts, produces something really remarkable called myokines. And these are essentially chemical signals that your muscle sends to the rest of the body to do something. So some of them tell your brain to grow new cells. Some of them reduce inflammation. Some of them improve the function of your heart and your liver. They are really powerful things. One of them, called irisin, has actually been shown in the research to cross the blood-brain barrier and directly support cognitive function. So when your muscles contract, whether it's a squat or a push-up or a plank, it's not just moving your body, it is sending protective signals to almost every other organ you have. This is why we now describe skeletal muscle, the ones that you can see, as an endocrine organ. It actively regulates the function of the rest of your body through the chemicals it releases. And this is also why muscle loss, which has a clinical name called sarcopenia, is one of the most underdiagnosed and underdiscussed drivers of accelerated aging. Sarcopenia typically begins in your 30s and then accelerates after 50, with people losing between 3 and 8% of their muscle mass per decade without intervention. By the time somebody's in their 70s, that loss can be profound enough to affect their ability to even get up off the floor or climb the stairs or recover from a fall. But the downstream effects start long before that. Less muscle means less glucose absorption, more insulin resistance, more inflammation.
Fewer protective myokines, and worse metabolic health as well. And that has massive effects on your risk of every major chronic disease that we know of, the stuff that we see in the A&E every single day. Every step down in muscle mass makes these 3 reasons we've already talked about much worse. And here's the thing that makes this particularly urgent. So the hormonal changes in midlife, like the drop in testosterone, the rise in cortisol, these actively accelerate muscle loss. Chronic inflammation actively accelerates muscle loss. Mitochondrial decline reduces the energy available for muscle repair. So the 3 processes we've just described aren't just separate problems running in parallel. They're all pointing at your muscle at the same time. So protecting muscle isn't just optional. It is the central task of aging well. Now, your brain is something that I don't think gets anywhere near enough attention in these sorts of conversations about aging, partly because people tend to think of physical aging and cognitive aging as separate tracks. Your body gets older, and separately, your brain gets older as well. But that is not what the biology shows. The same three processes driving everything we've discussed, like mitochondrial decline, hormonal shift, and chronic inflammation, these are the primary drivers of brain aging as well. If something affects your body below the neck, then it affects your brain as well. And understanding that changes how seriously you take the lifestyle interventions that we're going to talk about. Your brain is extraordinarily energy hungry. It accounts for roughly 2% of your body weight, but uses around 20% of your total energy. All of that energy is produced by your mitochondria, which we've already talked about. So when your mitochondrial function declines, the brain feels it acutely as well, in the form of brain fog and slower thinking, difficulty concentrating, losing things all the time, forgetting names, and just a general sense that your mental sharpness isn't what it was. This isn't imagination. It is cellular energy production declining in one of the organs that most depends on it. Chronic inflammation does something particularly damaging to the brain as well. Your brain has its own specialized immune cells called microglia, whose job it is to clean up damage and protect neural tissue. Now, when systemic inflammation is chronically elevated, driven by visceral fat and poor sleep and, ultra-processed food and chronic stress, those microglia become overactivated. Instead of just clearing damage, they start producing inflammatory signals of their own in a process called neuroinflammation. And neuroinflammation is now understood to be one of the central mechanisms behind Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. So again, this isn't a wacky idea that a lot of people think. This is what the research currently focuses on. The amyloid plaques that are visible in the brains of people with Alzheimer's aren't the starting point. They're partly a consequence of a brain that has been chronically inflamed for years or decades. And then we've got the hormonal piece as well. So estrogen, as I mentioned earlier, has a significant protective effects on brain function. The drop in estrogen during the menopause is associated with increased risk of cognitive decline. And this is one of the reasons why there's growing research interest in the timing of HRT, hormone replacement therapy, relative to the onset of menopause. Testosterone also supports cognitive function as well, particularly spatial reasoning and memory. And cortisol, chronically elevated cortisol, has been shown to directly damage the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain most responsible for forming new memories. Basically, chronic stress, in other words, is not just making you feel bad. It is physically shrinking one of the most important structures in your brain, the hippocampus. But here's the helpful part. Well, I'm hoping it's helpful anyway. Exercise is currently the only intervention with strong, consistent evidence for reducing the risk of dementia. Not a supplement, not any drug, but exercise. And the mechanisms are exactly what you'd expect given everything we've covered. Aerobic exercise stimulates the production of a molecule called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. We will discuss it in next video, and I hope you will follow this video deeply and being healthy.